Hi, and welcome back. Now we're going to talk about Romanticism. So this is a movement of the 1800s. It was an artistic, literary and intellectual movement that commenced during the Industrial Revolution. So in part it was a response to the fact that industrialism made everything dirty and smoggy and kind of ruined nature's beauty. It was also a revolt against the Enlightenment period and against the idea that you could rationalize nature. So for the Romantics, natural beauty was emblematic of God, and so trying to understand its mysteries was akin to trying to understand God. So it was considered a rather blasphemous thing to do from the Romantics' perspective. Romanticism stressed strong emotions, placing new emphasis on things like beauty, horror, and wildness. And so they mean wildness in the sense of natural, untamed beauty, but also a little bit in terms of people as well. The Unitarian religion and the concept of the Gothic are also strongly linked to Romanticism. So the Gothic genre tends to be texts that deal with the supernatural and that try and build up tension and horror. They're also texts that tend to use very highly ornate language. And if you've already read Frankenstein, you'll know that the language is very dense and verbose, and there's probably one word in three that you don't strictly need. And so that's very iconic of Gothic style of writing. As for the Unitarian religion, well, this was quite a controversial thing during the Romantic period. Unitarians were a kind of belief where they thought that there was only one God, hence the word Unitarian. So that differed from the traditional belief in the Trinity, where they had the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Unitarians believed that God was more of a force than a person, and that he was in everyone. So in a way they sort of demoted Jesus, is a way of putting it, because God wasn't just in Jesus, God was in everyone, and God was also in the flowers and trees and rocks and everything that he'd created. So that goes a long way to explain why the Romantics believed so strongly in the power of nature. But it also meant a lot of conflict. People who believed in Unitarianism could be kicked out of university, they could have their reputations destroyed, and sometimes even lose their jobs. So now we're going to think about the literary texts that were directly referenced in Frankenstein. So this includes the Prometheus myth by the Roman poet Ovid, and we'll talk more about the Prometheus myth later. There's also Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, Paradise Lost is a very long poem about the fall of Lucifer from heaven and his journey to becoming Satan, or the devil. And John Milton wrote this with a sort of empathetic feeling for the devil. And when the monster reads this book, he uses a quote from it saying that, to Victor, "I should have been your Adam, but instead I am your fallen angel." So you can see that the monster starts to empathize with Lucifer. There's also references to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this story is pretty much about a sailor who is stuck at sea due to supernatural forces, but it also has a really religious undertone. And finally, you have the poetry about Mont Blanc, which is from Percy by Shelley. So all of those things are directly referenced, and there are quotes given out of them in the text. And Mont Blanc in particular is sort of echoing the beauty of mountains and nature. And you'll remember that when Victor travels through the mountains, he always feels his spirits calmed, and the lake makes him feel special and calm. And so it shows that there's a sort of restorative power of nature, and that's obviously a very strong romantic belief. So now we're going to look at the particular values in Frankenstein and try and think about where they come from. The first one is the aesthetics of nature, which of course was a value of the Romantics because they believed that beauty derived from God. So that made them think that what was natural and instinctual was healthy and good. So the kind of not so logical follow-on from this is that they believed that beauty was a virtue and ugliness a vice, or evidence of poor character. So what they meant by that was, since beauty was an echo of God's beauty, if you were beautiful, you must also be like God, so you must be good. And if you are ugly, you must have less of godliness in you, and therefore you must be evil. So therefore, the poor old ugly monster, who is an abomination of nature, has pretty much no choice as far as the Romantics are concerned, but to be evil. Another value in Frankenstein is the questioning of the power of reason to order the universe. So basically, Mary Shelley doesn't really like this more Enlightenment concept. and she thinks it's presumptuous that Frankenstein believes he can play God. However, Mary Shelley doesn't hate all scientists. We know for a fact that she was reading Galvani. So perhaps the true message of the book is, beware of using logic without using reason or compassion. Another way of looking at it is that if Frankenstein had been a more responsible father to his creation, perhaps it wouldn't have gone on crazy killing sprees. Perhaps he should have taken the time and used Rousseau's philosophy to teach it morality. At first, after all, the monster wishes to learn about itself and the world in a philosophical, almost noble fashion. So in a way, the monster starts out embodying Rousseau's reasonable, natural man. It's only through its negative experiences that it turns into the monster that it becomes. Another value in Frankenstein we're thinking about is the role of women. So in this novel, the role is a fairly passive one, where Frankenstein's girlfriend waits for years and years to marry him, then they finally get married, and on that very night, she becomes sacrificed to his monster's rage. So she's portrayed as being childlike and good and honest and pure, and all of this is to highlight her role as a victim, but also to show that all of Frankenstein's dependents suffer when he neglects them. Another really obvious message in Frankenstein is don't play God. So now we're going to talk about the Prometheus myth, because after all, that is the subtitle. So basically the story of Prometheus is that of, it's a Greek story of an old god who makes the first human out of clay, and then he breathes life into it. So Zeus isn't particularly happy about this, because there are humans running around now, but he sort of ignores the whole process. However, Prometheus goes one step further, and he steals some of Zeus's fire so that humankind can be warm and cook its food and all of these sorts of things. At this point, Zeus becomes furious because fire is something that only the gods alone are supposed to have. And so he gets his own revenge on the humans later, but in the meantime he has Prometheus chained to a rock and has his liver pecked out by eagles for his trouble. So the moral of this story is, God gets cranky when you do the magic tricks that are only reserved for him. So while I don't think Mary Shelley has a problem with any of us making fire, she believes that we shouldn't be responsible for playing with life and death. Another value questioned in Frankenstein is human ambition. So again, this is an Enlightenment value that is portrayed in a pretty negative light. So this involves things like exploring frontiers, new science, revolutionary governments, and discovery, and for the Enlightenment these were all considered good things. So generally the Enlightenment was trying to emulate the Renaissance, so humanism was popular. Now humanism is basically the belief in human ambition and the idea that we are all capable of great genius and artistry, and pushing the boundaries to see how far humans can go. However, some people, like Mary Shelley, worried about how these new discoveries and the genius pursuits of man would be used. So now we're going to have a look at Blade Runner, and we're going to start by looking at the director, Ridley Scott. He was born in 1937. He is an English film director known for his stylish visuals and obsession with detail. He grew up in Teesside, whose industrial landscape inspired a lot of the scenes you see in Blade Runner. He is known for atmospheric lighting, smoke, fans, slow pacing, strong female characters, and sons who end up killing their fathers. And all of those things actually occur in Blade Runner. So Blade Runner is based on Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And it might even be worth having a quick look at that text to see how it influenced Blade Runner. Starring Harrison Ford and featuring an acclaimed soundtrack by Vangelis, Blade Runner flopped at the box office, so it was a huge disappointment in 1982. Now there are a couple of reasons for this. One, it had a really complicated plot, which it was believed American audiences had trouble following, and the ending was a sad one. So then they made a new version, which is the one that you study. So they made the director's cut in 1991, which removed the voiceovers and modified the ending so that the future was a little bit more uncertain for the replicants. Then there was a third cut made, which Scott personally supervised, called the final cut, and you may even want to check out how that differs from your text as well. Today, Blade Runner is ranked as one of the most important sci-fi films of the 20th century, despite its rocky beginning, and is considered responsible for initiating the cyberpunk genre. So as we know in English, any text that is influential in starting a brand new genre usually becomes a classic. And this is actually something that Blade Runner and Frankenstein have in common. Blade Runner was responsible for the cyberpunk genre, and Frankenstein was very influential on the Gothic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the context of the film, and we're going to talk about the 1980s. Even though the text that you're studying was made in 1991, the groundwork for that film took place during the 80s, so that's what we're going to focus on. The 80s was a highly consumerist decade. The stock market was glamorized, fast food chains boomed, corporate and government institutions tended to be rife with corruption and sexual harassment. So you see some of this already influencing the film in terms of the corrupt Blade Runner force and the way that Tyrell lives his life. Arcade games, video games, and computers became a major industry, so technology was a bigger part of people's daily life as well. Scientific growth, including manned space flights resuming in 1981, and advances in genetics, with the first cloned mouse, Masha, in 1986, were all things that were influencing how people were viewing the world, and they all found their way into Blade Runner. So you might even think about quoting this publication, Biophysica, where they first talked about the cloned mouse, as being highly influential on Blade Runner. Pop music, music videos, keyboard synthesizers, drum machines, and the era of the DJ all meant a very particular style of popular culture that was prevalent in the 1980s. Fashion also included perms, shoulder pads, leggings, leg warmers, hair gel, multiple bangles, and plastic jewellery. In fact, plastic was very popular for furniture as well as clothing. And if you remember in Blade Runner, one of the replicants wears a see-through plastic raincoat. So now we're going to have a look at the values in Blade Runner and how they play out. So corporate greed and consumerism are emphasised in Blade Runner's billboards and the continual drone of off-world advertising. Scott's warning against the soulless capitalist trend of the US is seen in Tyrell's pyramid, which represents the capitalist social pyramid where the wealthy few are at the top and the poor masses are at the bottom. Or you could also see it as being representative of the ancient Egyptians who abused their power because, of course, the pyramids were built with slave labour. The technology of Blade Runner might not look like much to us, but it was considered state-of-the-art visually in the 1980s and was influenced by electronica and the revival of the space program, which made us once again dream of space exploration, expansion, and money to be made off-world. Environmental concern is another issue that Ridley Scott particularly tries to push. It tended to take a back seat in the 80s after the first boom of the 60s and 70s. And Ridley warns against this by providing unnatural lighting and only genetically modified animals, since the real equivalents are all considered to be extinct. So there's a lot of sort of negative warnings in Blade Runner, so much so that you could almost consider it a dystopian vision of the future. The science of cloning was also a reality for 80s dwellers, thanks to Masha the Mouse. Christian groups and ethics groups protested against the technology, while scientists, university and medical groups were generally in favour of it. So the public were often affronted by a technology they did not quite understand. So for the average person, they couldn't see much difference between cloning a mouse and the next step, which might be cloning a human being, which of course brought up all of the ethical values that they'd considered hundreds of years ago when the Enlightenment was considering a person's responsibility to their creations. So I hope that helps you understand some of the values and issues in both texts. That's the end of this lesson. If you feel like you need more help, please visit us at www.primeeducation.com.au.